Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Federica Gusmeroli, and I have the pleasure and honor to be Zanichelli editor of Performate textbook series. In this webinar, we're going to discover a new way of teaching English successfully through phases and personalization. Our guides in this discovery will be Margaret Layton and Elisabetta Fiordiliso. Good afternoon, Margaret.
Good afternoon, Federica, and welcome to everybody to this webinar.
And good afternoon, Elisabetta.
Hi, everyone, and welcome.
Before starting, let me tell you something about our speakers. Margaret Layton has had a long teaching career in both the British and Italian education systems. She began teaching English language, literature, and history in secondary schools and the sixth form college. In parallel, for 27 years, she organized and ran a summer language school in Surrey, teaching English as a foreign language. In 1999, she took up an English teaching and coordinating position at the Università Cattolica in Milan. Since 2006, she has been writing English textbooks for the Italian secondary schools with Marina Spiazzi and Marina Tavella. Elisabetta Fiordiliso has been teaching English in Italian secondary schools for over 30 years. In 2008, she started working as a teacher trainer in courses for the professional development of secondary school teachers on cooperative learning, competence-based teaching and learning, skills assessment and certification, and Invalsi tests. So now I think we're all ready to start, and I'll hand over to Margaret.
Thank you, Federica. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, From Foundation to Growth. We're going to be looking at learning English at different phases. So to give you a quick idea, we have a word cloud showing some of the areas we're going to be looking at in the webinar. And we can talk about our agenda, which is, we're going to talk about multimodality and personalization. Then we will look at teaching through phases, move on to how to build personalization in the classroom with strategies and techniques. And in the last part of the webinar, we will have an insight into the changes in the Common European Framework reference for language regarding the shift from skills to modes of communication in order to promote cooperative learning. Before we begin the webinar proper, I would just like to reflect with you about our post-COVID teaching world. Many teachers in the post-COVID school have highlighted negative changes in their students. In fact, according to a national survey, which was done by Gaslini in January, 71% of children and teenagers between the ages of 6 and 17 have shown some behavioral disorders like heightened anxiety, sleep disorder, or even symptoms of depression. So I would like to share this moment with you to hear in our poll, which is the most common post-COVID effect of learning in your particular classes. So is it maybe gaps in the students' basic knowledge? Is it psychological discomfort? Perhaps it has to do with learning difficulties or with difficulty concentrating, or maybe lack of interest in social relationships. I'd like you to look at those points for a moment and click on the one that you feel is the most common in your classes. I'll give you a few moments. 2 more minutes for you to have a little think. Well, this is really interesting because although all of them to some extent, the ones that seem to be the most important here are gaps in the student's basic knowledge and difficulty concentrating. I think it is clear that teaching and the transmission of knowledge have become more complex. And the students now need more guidance to develop and achieve skills. This means as teachers, we need to remodulate our approach, looking for a new pace, perhaps proceeding at different speeds, and to bear in mind these differences for each class situation. So going back to our webinar agenda, multimodality and personalization. Now, these two words we believe to be key in dealing with this new, slightly more complex situation. Let's look at them both individually. We'll start with multimodality. The teacher presents content through different modes in multimodality in order to accommodate different styles in the class. So different means of representation and transmission, verbal, visual, auditive, continuous, non-continuous text, maps, schemes, diagrams, videos, and pictures. I think you'll agree that students live in a much more visual world. Different modes of action and participation in the lesson, not just question and answer, but presentations, discussions, debates, cooperative learning, production, even physical production through karaoke and role playing. We need different strategies to develop interest and motivation, to promote and help our students cope with the renewed effort required and with self-regulation. How do we do this? Through positive reinforcement, formative feedback. We need to stimulate their curiosity. Ask them to verbalize the reconstruction process. So, modality, multimodality, will now look at personalization. Now, the basic principle of personalization strategies was first talked about by Vygotsky in his zone of proximal development. He, in fact, looked at 3 particular areas of learning. The first one he called a too easy zone, then the zone of proximal development, and then an area he called a too hard zone. Now, the too easy zone is what our students in the first year can do easily without help. We might reasonably think of this as perhaps an A1 level for the whole class, but maybe 2/3 of the class are at an A2 level. We identify this too easy zone, what students can do without help, as a phase of foundation. So this takes us into our next phase in the webinar about teaching through phases. And here you will see at the top right-hand corner our new language book for Former B1, which is actually called Phases, because we believe very much that students learn to expand gradually. They need, first of all, a foundation phase. The foundation phase, which is based on what they know already and the skills they can do without external help. This is a phase that will be full of link back exercises, encouraging them to bring out the things they know. Tell your partner 5 things you do every day. Look around you, write 5 items of clothing you can see. What do you usually eat and drink during the day? These are bringing out the knowledge that they have. The focus in this phase is on reception. The foundation phase aims to diagnose whether our students can really do the basics without help. If not, some work of revision will be required before they can move on and extend their knowledge. This foundation phase in the book is more slimlined. The units are quicker so that they can proceed at a quicker pace before they move on to the next phase, which here we call core and expansion. This is the phase that corresponds to Vygotsky's idea of zone of proximal development, because what the students can do already, they are not learning new things and new skills. This area, the ZPD area, is where the real learning occurs, because the third area, what I can't do, is requiring skills they don't have and they will turn off and not learn. So here, the ZPD, the essential learning zone, the difference between what a learner can do without help and what he and she can achieve with guidance and encouragement. He deliberately used the word proximal because it refers to the skills that the learner is close to mastering. And this is the real learning area where he can solidify what he knows, move from reception to production. He must be presented with tasks just outside the ability range. So once the student has solidified the foundation, moved into a core and expansion phase, they are ready for the final growth phase. This is where more challenging tasks can promote the maximum cognitive growth. And this is the phase that will challenge them to move on, to extend, to develop and extend their own competencies. Now, this idea of moving through phases, you don't do the core till you have a foundation. You don't do the expand till you have a core. You don't do the growth until you have expanded your skills, is very similar to the idea of scaffolding that I'm sure you are all aware of. So let's look at scaffolding in slightly more detail. So what is scaffolding? Scaffolding is the idea that skills must be learned in a specific order without jumping around. A foundational skill must be learned and mastered before a student can move into a more difficult skill. So the question here is, how do I build up personalization in my classroom? What are the strategies and techniques that I can use to build up this idea of personalization? How can you apply them to your students' learning? Assessment is the key, because everybody's zone of proximal development is different, and everyone's personal ZPD will move as they start to learn new knowledge and new skills. You need to assess where they are now and then assess how they learn best. Vygotsky said they need a more knowledgeable other, an MKO. Now, this can be the teacher, it can be a classmate, it can be a video tutorial. This MKO is the one who is going to move the tutee to acquire new skills. And once you have tested a new skill for yourself and believe the tutees have internalized the work made by the MKO or others, you're ready to continue to climb the scaffold and go on to a new phase. In fact, Vygotsky was a strong advocate of social interaction. He saw social interaction as cooperative dialogue. Through this cooperative dialogue, the student is able not only to perform the task, but to internalize it. And this is when the real learning happens. Once the task is internalized, the student can guide themselves through the task and complete it without external help from the MKO. Take on responsibility for their own learning. Let's have a quick look at what we can see as formative needs and then the personalization objectives. Because the need is to develop a knowledge of essentials, and this can be done through catching up, reinforcing learning results. Students need to acquire an efficient study method, so they need strategies that fit to their individual learning style. They need to develop talents and interests, and these need to be personalized through inclination and personal interest. Open up to interpersonal relationships. We can do this by promoting socialization in the class context. At the same time, they need to feel they are part of a formative community. And this can be done through cooperative learning, through group work, through mediation, which is an area we are going to look at later on in the webinar. They need to develop an idea of responsible citizenship because they are moving on from the school into a wider world. So, what are the techniques of personalization that we can use? Well, there are many. First of all, we need to build an individual student profile. We talked about assessment. We need to think of multi-level lessons. We need to use pair work efficiently and group work, similar learning styles and formative needs and interests to form groups. We need to look at peer teaching, something we'll look at in greater detail in a moment. The think aloud pair problem solving. We had this model of think, pair, share that we talked about a lot in the last webinar. And then the last technique we'll look at is reciprocal teaching. So all of these techniques are organized, hopefully, to help build up a personalization of the learning process. Now, in the new language book, we have thought long and hard about ways to make it possible for students to move at different paces while using the same book. And we decided to add 2 digital paths, one to help revise for students who need to relook at some perhaps grammar structures they haven't quite understood, but at the same time to encourage students that feel they have learned them well to go into more challenging areas. So these 2 digital paths will run parallel all through the book, and students can click on these. We've called them revise for those who need to go over what they have done, and extend for those who want to push themselves further. And they can click on these and use their own personal devices for extra exercises to reinforce or extra exercises to challenge. When they click, these kind of exercises will come up. In this particular case, they're looking at the present simple and adverbs of frequency. In the revise exercises, these will be done at a foundation level. In the extend level, they will be more challenging. These exercises can be used individually for students. They can be used in pairs or groups, or if the teacher wants, maybe they feel that the whole class needs to revise a particular grammar structure, and they can be used together. The other technique we mentioned was pair work. So the first technique we can use in a multi-level classroom is definitely pair work, because we can put students of equal ability or even like ability together. This is when we can choose students that have the same competencies in the skill being worked on. And those that are close in a skill level will allow for the greatest verbal interaction and collaboration. The whole class may be working on the same exercise, but perhaps have different requirements. For example, a reading task might ask pairs of a lower level to complete 5 questions, when a higher level pair can complete 10 or possibly more. In equal ability groups, each student will have a similar or equal ability level. When they receive the same task, but have different requirements, the focus is usually on accuracy. For example, in the case of a grammar rule, students will have the same grammar rule to look at, but exercises graded differently. In a reading exercise, there might be simpler WH questions for a lower skill level and more expanded, in-depth questions for the higher. Even in writing, they can work at different levels, because the lower level students can perhaps produce some structured sentences, while the higher level have more freedom in an open paragraph. Let's look at an example from the Phases book for these kind of pair work and group work tasks. Here, this is a double interview where 2 students are talking about family. So first of all, we have some vocabulary exercises to bring them into the video. Then small groups where one is noting down questions, another is looking at the girls' answers, another is looking at the boys' answers. And then we come to a less structured exercise, more open, the oral interaction. And here, different level groups can work at different levels. A lower level might be focusing on vocabulary, might be focusing on the answers. Higher level might be thinking of more detailed questions to carry out interviews with other students in the class. This is a double interview about families. Then also talking about group work, we have a very useful example here from Jill Sinclair Bell's book about teaching multi-level classes, in which she formed a grouping matrix. This requires a little effort at the beginning of the year, but afterwards it can be used throughout the teaching year to form pairs or groups. What did she do? She gave every student a letter and a color. She ranks the students' abilities and places them on a grid. In this particular example, Julia has the lowest level and Ariana the highest. This is a grid for the teacher's own personal use. The students never see it. So the A's are all at a similar low level. Then there are the B's and C's and the D's at a high level. As you can see from the use of the color columns, they can also be multi-level groups. So you put the greens together and you have Melissa, Jason, Anna, and Alice. So homogeneous groups, they can be based on similar learning styles, on similar formative needs, the types of gaps that they may have, levels of acquired competencies, and similar interests. So a useful exercise to do once you have formed your groups can be through the flipped classroom. This is a useful method to align classes. You can assign the flipped classroom exercises for the students to carry out individually at home, before starting an audio-visual activity in class in a following lesson. At home, students can do some before watching activities to acquire the necessary vocabulary, and then some while watching exercise to get the general meaning and some important detail about the content of the video. But going back to our idea of personalizing the pace of learning, lower level students can slow down the recording. They can also watch the video as many times as they want until they feel confident that they have understood. Higher level students, of course, can watch and listen at a higher speed and be prepared to carry out group discussions in class. Let's look at another example based on oral interaction and oral production. So in mixed ability groups, each member will have a different competency level and so should be given a task that is slightly different so that their contribution is tangible. The focus in this kind of group work is fluency. So in a discussion, you might find that the lower level students can prepare perhaps by writing a few agree or disagree statements and also revising some useful vocabulary. Here, the oral interaction is about sports. So students are discussing whether team sports or individual sports offer more. And the oral production, selecting a question and preparing a detailed answer. This can be done first as an oral discussion and then even go into a writing exercise. Again, the topic is important, something they feel they have some experience with. In this case, it's holidays and packing. So what do you think travel essentials are? Do you find packing stressful? We've talked about group work and pair work. Both are necessary in a multi-level class, but it is also important that they keep in mind the fact they are part of a learning community. So it is good to begin and end each lesson with a whole class activity. These can be quite simple. For example, you might focus on vocabulary or pronunciation. You can use minimum pair sounds where there will be one sound that changes in a word, bill, bell, that students have to differentiate. Or you might use something like this circle chat. Now, the circle chat is an activity for the whole class to do together. It can be a pre-writing or pre-discussion exercise. And it's quite simple to set up because you divide the class into two, and the first half forms a circle. Then the second half forms a circle around the first half. So you have an inner circle and an outer circle. The inner circle turns to look at the outer circle and forms a pair. Now, the interesting about this activity is that students can work with a variety of partners. It gives them great exposure to other thoughts, gets their imagination going. And it means that often they are working with somebody they would not normally do pair work with. You can give them a simple question like this one based on the weather. What's the weather like today? What do you think it will be tomorrow? Or slightly more complex, where they are discussing what their favorite season might be in the next slide, or whether maybe the weather affects their mood. Other whole class activities can be project work. Now, in our new book phases, at the end of each phase, there is an active citizenship lab which proposes different possible projects to work on together. And this is the kind of thing that they can do in mixed ability groups. Again, reinforcing the idea that within the group, each student has a specific task suitable to their skills level. The project here proposed is to do with screen time. First, they carry out a survey, and then if they extend it, they can produce some presentations and perhaps even some tips about how to limit your screen time. The other technique we mentioned at the beginning is peer tutoring. Now, peer tutoring is an ideal method to revise and extend, maybe in some didactic pauses. It's a method of personalization that enables the teacher to work on the formative needs of pairs of students, planning the choice of contents and procedures. It foresees an exchange of roles between tutor and tutee. He talked about, Keith Topping, in his books on peer tutoring and the advantages, he talked about asymmetric pairs, where you have two students, but one is slightly more skilled, perhaps, than the other, and takes on the role of tutor, and the other the role of tutee. So the tutor is teaching and helping, while the tutee is learning and improving. The theory behind this peer tutoring comes from a very interesting statistic on levels of comprehension. Here we have the type of learning strategy and then the level of comprehension. Very interesting to see, because the receptive exercises like reading or listening give a disappointing level of comprehension of 15%. This jumps to 40 if they discuss the information, and an impressive 80% if in some way it becomes a direct practical experience. But we look at the final, very impressive 90% of comprehension, which comes from teaching others. So, looking at this peer tutoring, we have advantages, of course, for the tutee who is learning, but there are advantages also for the tutor. They are revising concepts, knowledge and skills, because they have to think of the best way to present them and explain them. It develops their communicative skills and consolidates their use of vocabulary. It also improves their self-esteem and social skills. The advantages for the tutee: perhaps students feel more relaxed and at ease if they are being taught by a classmate rather than someone in authority like the teacher. It might be easier for them to accept the correction of wrong concepts. And again, it is building relationships, practicing appropriate social interaction. But the other great advantage, hopefully, is that they learn the grammar point or language function that the tutor is explaining to them. So, important. Keith Topping says that the tutor is only slightly better than the tutee. Too great a difference in the skill level is very off-putting. The final technique we're going to look at together is reciprocal teaching. This, in a way, grows out of the idea of the peer teaching, because, again, you are using students as teachers. You are helping them with their 90% comprehension. So the reciprocal teaching strategy was first used by Anne Brown and Anne-Marie Sullivan-Palisker. And it can be used in class Above all, where students maybe have problems with reading comprehension, with narrative, descriptive, or argumentative text, under the teacher's supervision. In the before, during, and after reading strategies. So when you're using reciprocal teaching, the activity, the teaching activity is carried out in turn by different students. This could be in groups. This could be as a whole class situation. The important thing is that the teacher is no longer monopolizing the teaching. It is moving into the students, and they go through the various steps, which are reading the text aloud in blocks and sequences, making predictions and anticipations, asking questions, clarifying doubts and questions from the others in the class, and finally, summarizing to verify the oral comprehension of the whole class. So if we're looking at multi-level groups, first of all, they can have maybe a reading comprehension. And here I am looking for each unit in the book has a section on competencies for life. This particular one is how to be a responsible tourist. And the students can discuss, have you ever heard of volunteer holidays? What are they? What activities do they do? Then move into the reading comprehension, which is here about summer camps in the wild, and go through the steps we've talked about, reading text aloud, making predictions, asking questions, clarifying, and maybe then looking at the questions in pairs or groups. Okay, we are now moving into the final part of our webinar, which is talking about the shift from skills to modes of communication in order to promote cooperative learning. And for this part of the webinar, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Elisabetta Fiordilisa.
Okay, so let's move to this last part, which is about some aspects, starting from what's new in the Common European Framework of Reference. So you probably know that in 2018, the Council of Europe issued a new updated version of the Common European Framework, and 2 years later, a companion version to assist teachers with course planning. Now, which are the innovations brought about in the new framework? Well, these, for example, include the shift from the 4 skills to a totally new vision of the language teaching and learning approach, which is based on what the experts call the 4 modes of communication. There is also a new action-oriented approach, and the new framework is based on an action-oriented approach which represents a shift away from the syllabuses based on a linear progression through language structures towards a syllabuses based on the analysis of the students' needs, on the real-world communicative needs, and it is also oriented towards more real-life tasks. So it really introduces a new vision of the learner as a social agent, and we're going to have a look at all this. So the new framework focuses on the idea that the 4 skills should not be considered as separate communicative language competencies like in the past, but as basic abilities that students should consolidate in order to pass on to more challenging forms of communication, which are the ones that we use actually in everyday life. So in real life, what do? We interact, which means we listen and we speak at the same time, but sometimes we also have to respond to some unexpected questions. It happens every day. So teaching interaction is more than just teaching expressions and sentences which are useful in everyday life, but it means really exposing the students to and letting them experiment a large variety of situations and language which reflect everyday modes of communication. And this implies interacting with others, mediating ideas, or concepts, or using some or all of the 4 language skills at the same time. So the 4 modes of communication, to allow the students experiment the 4 modes of communication in a very effective way, teachers should construct their syllabuses. Let's have an example in our case for a B1 class, for example, starting from the consolidation of the basic vocabulary and grammar. And at an initial stage, students will also empower their basic receptive and productive skills through some more guided activities, which will also include some guided interaction. In a later moment of the school year, so as soon as they have consolidated the basic receptive and productive skills, students can be involved in some more challenging class activities, and they can start experimenting with more complex modes of communication, which imply, for example, the use of different skills at the same time, and some written interaction, some online interaction, so some less guided forms of interaction, and also some mediation. Now let's have a look at mediation, this new word in, well, not totally new, actually was present in the previous framework, but it has a totally new dimension now. So what do you really know about mediation? Try to give your answers from your own experience and say if you have experimented mediation activities in classes, or I have heard about mediation, but I've never experimented in my classes, or you can answer just freely, I don't know much about mediation. We are here to help. So give your answers. I give you a few moments to answer, to click on the answer that you prefer. So let's have a look at your answers. So I'm very pleased to hear, actually, that only few of you have experimented some mediation activities in class, which is, so I don't know much about mediation, it's 49%. So let's move on to some mediation, to some ideas of mediation, and let's explain what mediation is. So mediation is a type of oral or written interaction that takes place among people speaking different languages, or even the same language but at different levels. So what happens in our classes, for example. So mediation tasks can include activities such note-taking, translating, interpreting, paraphrasing, or even summarizing oral or written texts. Now, the text that you can use can be either in L1, which means in Italian, or in L2 to L2. So we will have a look at some mediation activities later on, but here we can give you some examples of how learners can mediate. For example, learners mediate when they discuss how to approach a task, they mediate when they think something through together, or they mediate when they explain something to a classmate, take notes or information from the web, or when they relate the content to a text or a text to others. And when they help a classmate understand something they don't understand, for example. So let's have a look at some fundamentals of mediation. The fundamentals of mediation are, first of all, needs analysis. So we have to analyze the students' needs, which means that we have to select mediation activities which are really involving and also relevant for the learner's perspective use of language. Then there must be a connection to real life. So we have to really create situations that students might encounter in real life every day. So this implies a shift from the old vision of communication that was based on the idea that we have to bring the real world into our classroom. I don't know, most of you might remember this quotation. So to a more updated idea that aims at connecting the classroom to the real world. And the centrality of action is really important. This means that we have to shift from a language-centered approach to a task-centered approach, which has the aim to fulfill tasks in order to learn language aspects and also to gain new skills. It is also important to have context-related specificity, which means that students will be giving a precise indication of what, where, when, why, how, and with whom we are mediating. And mediation activities are also very nice means to involve students at using different modes of communication, competencies, activities, languages, and modalities. So let's have a look at how to bring a mediation into our classes. So when we start creating, this is a mediation activity already made, but if you want to create your own also other mediation activities, let's start from this idea, this example first. So when we set up a mediation activity, our aim is to help the students become social agents as prescribed by the framework. So what we have to focus on is to create activities that really empower the students' ability to collaborate in group, but to solve a problem or to fulfill a task. So let's have a look at the steps that we have to take in creating a mediation activity. First of all, you have to choose a mediation activity. In this case, it's mediating a text. And we also have to select a strategy in particular. In this case, it's relaying specific information, which means pass on a specific information to a classmate, but in a simpler way. So using a language which might be understood even by a person who has a lower level of the language, so English in our case. Actually, in this case, this mediation activity implies a text, a video, which is in Italian, and they have to take notes and refer what they hear in English to a classmate. Now, what you have to do next is also to create a real life scenario. So in this case, the real life scenario is that you received an email from an English speaking friend. He wanted to have some tips about what to visit while in Italy. And you also have to choose a cooperative learning strategy. And later on, you have to create groups. Now, you can use different forms of cooperative learning, investigation, brainstorming, think, then, share, circle, chat. We've seen some of them. What we're going to have a look at is that kind of mediation activity using the jigsaw, which is something you definitely have heard about. Let's have a look at an example. In this case, this is another example mediation activity, and in particular, it's based on mediating concepts, and there is a real life task, a real life situation, which is a project they have to create for school. The task is the strategy is collaborating in a group. In this case, we have selected a typical group work, which is based on a group on the jigsaw. So what do you have to do? We have three pieces of text. There's three different texts here, text A, B, and C, for student A, B, or C. What you have to do is to create groups with 3 students in each group. Then you assign one text to each student, text A to student A, text B to student B, text C to student C. Each student with the same text will go into a new group, which is called the group of the experts. What do? Each member is assigned a task. They work in a parallel. So student A together with other student A, student B together with other student B. And what do they do in this expert group? They can work at their own pace. They can take their time to study the text, to share ideas, to get prepared, to rehearse their part before going back to their previous group. In the last step, their role is to explain, to report, to pass on the information in their text to the rest of the group. Now, this is a sort of a reciprocal teaching. So I explain this to you and you explain this to me. So again, another teaching among pairs, which is a very nice activity to do, and they learn a lot. Margaret told you, most of the learning comes from teaching to a pair, so it is a very effective activity. You can also decide to use different types of group work. For example, you can work in parallel, like in the example of the expert group. You can work in sequence, you can work in collaborative groups. Let's have a look at an active citizenship lab. In this case, this lab covers between 3, 4, 5 hours lesson. So it's a complete part of the UDA that you can use in your classes. This is only one page that we're showing to you, but you will have a whole lesson plan organized. In this case, the group is divided into the project is divided into 2 parts, and students can work in class and at home at the same time. What they have to do is to have their own assignment. In this case, they have to create a sort of weekly diet, to balance the diet, and each student in the group, we have 7 students, is assigned 1 day. So each student will work and plan a daily menu, which is balanced at his own pace, with no stress, so he can take his time and create his own part, work on his part of the product. Then they insert their slides in sequence in a PowerPoint, for example. At the end, when they have all contributed to this, they can revise all together the work. Now, which are the positive aspects of working in group in this way? The preparation stage of the activity can give each student the chance to do some research and work at the task assigned at their own pace. So they have no stress at all. They have no pressure from the outside. Now, in fulfilling this task, each student can also use the strategy, the learning strategy that best fits his or her learning style. And at the same time, this activity is also highly effective in promoting socialization in the class context, in educating to citizenship and group work, and in creating a very good atmosphere in class. Now, I have personally experimented both the mediation activities and active citizenship lab in my classes, and they were really successful. In particular, in one class, I experimented a lot of mediation activities because, as I imagine is the situation all over Italy, I had 3 girls coming from Ukraine last year who could not speak Italian at all, and my students have learned to mediate all the time between Italian and English. So it is really a very a real situation that you can encounter in everyday life, and our students are very pleased to work on that. Now, I suppose we are over, so we thank you a lot for your attention, and now there is a little time for some questions. If you want to intervene and say something, let's stop sharing for a while.
So thank you, Elisabetta, and thank you, Margaret, for your engaging talk. I was looking at the chat while you were talking, and I saw that towards the end, while you were talking about mediation and cooperative learning, there were a few teachers saying, well, it's very interesting, but this activity is very interesting. We tried it, but it requires a lot of time. Can you give some suggestions about how to monitor your time with these activities?
Margaret, do you want to answer? You want me to answer? We can't hear you, Margaret.
Turn off the microphone off. I think it's the mediation part. So I think you should answer, Elisabetta.
Okay, so mediation activities. Well, at the very beginning, it is not very easy to set students in a realistic scenario. But as soon as they get used to it, they really enjoy working on mediation. And for teachers, it is a bit challenging at the beginning, so it's not very easy to set up a mediation activity at the very beginning. But as you move on and when you practice on mediation activities that are already there for you to use, so you can experiment some already organized mediation activities, then you can also practice some more in everyday situations. So it is really interesting and not too easy in a second moment. At the very beginning, it's just a bit. What I want to underline is this: you don't have to confuse between mediation and translation, because I've read a lot of stuff on the internet and also on some textbooks that create a sort of confusion between what mediation is and translation is. So I've read a lot of exercises about translation. Instead of having the name translation, they have the name mediation. Well, mediation is not translating, or at least it's not translating word by word. Mediating, it means passing on information to somebody else, but in a very easy, in a very simple way. Like in everyday life, if you meet somebody in the street who can't speak Italian very well and you have to help him, that's a mediation activity that our students can experiment. And again, as I said, in my classes, they have to experiment mediation with these students coming from Ukraine who would not speak a word of English, and an exchange student coming from Germany. So they have to mediate between Italian and English all the time, and they are really getting better through that. So, and my lesson, they can mediate between English and English, so they can experiment all forms of mediation. I don't know if I answered your questions. I suppose so.
Yes,
Yeah.
Lots of people talking about mediation.
I know. So it was really nice also to build up mediation activities. I really liked experimenting them in class before writing all about mediation with my team group. So with my friends, Margaret, Marina Tavella and Marina Spiazzi. It was really interesting to work on that all together.
Yeah, some teachers are asking whether it is better to use this technique using a first and second language, or different levels of second language, because they don't want their students to translate into Italian. Right.
No. Actually, it's not a translation between English and Italian and English, as we said. You can experiment both. So I tend to experiment both ways. So I can sometimes start from an Italian video. It is very nice to use Italian videos or Italian texts and ask your students to paraphrase or to take notes, because mediation involves taking notes, paraphrasing, simplifying, or summarizing. So they also experiment other strategies that are useful not only in mediation but also in other typical communicative activities in class. So I don't know if there is.
Yeah, one more question. Maybe I think we have time for one more question. Can you tell us something about how to assess all these kind of activities? Because many teachers said very interesting, but there was a teacher asking about assessment.
Oh yes, Margaret.
I think before I answer the question, I'm just going to give a personal greeting to Christina Dendi. Hi, Christina. Nice to see that you left a note in the chat. We worked together as colleagues in the past. Anyway, assessment. There are various types of assessment. I think that in group work, it is one of the problems that teachers have. But I'm a great believer in self-assessment. I think it's very interesting if you've done a group, some group work together, to get the students themselves to look back and give themselves some feedback, or possibly if you're doing the kind of role play in which they are presenting to the rest of the class can look at the idea of assessment. However, a more formal assessment is available in the teacher's guide. because here there will be a griglia di valutazione, which will be very helpful for teachers who want to look at how to assess the group. But try both. Have faith in your students and do some self-assessment as well.
Yeah, I think one of the key words of your talk was mediation, and now lots of teachers are talking about it. There's Tiziana saying mediation a key word for so many activities to be promoted in our society, not only about languages.
Right, right.
It's a very interesting move forward, isn't it, in English teaching, this idea of mediating. It can be writing, it can be reading, it can be oral, and I think it's a very interesting new area. Don't you think, Elisabetta?
Yeah. Well, as I said, you know that I love mediation. I know that you are asking this because you know that I adore mediation.
Okay.
Okay, so there are many people thanking you in the chat, and I think we're pretty much on time. So I think our webinar is over.
Yes, I suppose we should organize another webinar on mediation activities.
Yeah, yeah. There was someone in the chat.
Assessment. We could go on and on and on.
Yes.
I noticed in the chat box that some teachers have created their own grids of assessment. I think that's a wonderful idea.
Yeah, there was someone asking, I want to know more about mediation. So I think.
Well, mediation is a totally new thing. And we're very proud of, we have decided, we really decided to put mediation. I know it is challenging with a B1. But yeah, but I think that you can also experiment mediation with a A2, B1 level. It really depends on how you work on that. So yeah, it's not challenging. It's very fun. It's real fun.
Thank you for your lovely comments in the chat box. I'm reading some of them now, and very rewarding. Thank you.
Yes, really. Thank you.
Yeah, so now thank you everybody for joining us today. A big thank you to our speakers, Margaret and Elisabetta. And have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Okay, and let's thank also Marina Tavelli and Marina Spiazzi, because we worked all together. So.
And Federica.
And Federica, of course.
Okay, thank you.
For your invaluable work. Thank you, Federica.
Let's say thank you to the teachers.
Valentina, who's organizing the webinar too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much again.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. See you next time.